Welcome to #VOA. I'm John Walker with our host Michael Lippin.
Hey, John.
And Andrew Pelcheski, our social media reporter. Andrew, what's happening today?
Well, people are still talking about the attacks in Paris. Actually, as we're speaking now, Presidents Obama and Hollande are speaking at the White House. And this has led to a conversation on refugees. Could they come in? Are they bringing terrorism? A lot of questions being asked about that.
Right, and we're going to look at the Syrian refugee issue in this week's show with one of our national correspondents, as well as two women intimately familiar with the Syrian refugee situation in the U.S. But first, Andrew, it's that time.
It's that time. I got to do it. Roll it, Scott.
Welcome to #VOA. I'm Michael Lippin in Washington. The Paris attacks have created an uncertain future for Syrian refugees who want to resettle in the United States. The House of Representatives has voted to suspend the acceptance of the Syrians until the vetting process is reviewed and strengthened. The Senate is considering similar legislation. In the meantime, polls taken after the Paris attacks show a sharp increase in Americans' concerns about terrorism in general and about the Islamic State in particular. We begin with VOA's Michael Bowman.
Amid stepped-up security measures from Brussels to New York, a tougher tone from President Barack Obama on the fight against Islamic State.
And we will destroy them. We will take back land that they are currently in. We will cut off their financing. We will hunt down their leadership. We will dismantle their networks and their supply lines, and we will ultimately destroy them.
A new poll shows 28% of Americans list terrorism as their top issue in next year's presidential contest, topped only by the economy at 33%. The poll shows majority support for stepping up U.S. airstrikes against Islamic State, as well as an increased use of American ground forces. And it shows majority opposition to resettling Syrian refugees in the United States.
I will absolutely take database on the people coming in from Syria if we can't stop it.
The treatment of Syrian asylum seekers exploded as an issue on the campaign trail.
If I win, they're going back. We can't have them. They're going back.
We don't want to enhance the recruitment of ISIS and the others by acting like we're going to shut our borders.
That message is echoed by the Obama administration as it scrambles to reassure a wary public.
Right now, refugees wait 18 to 24 months while the screening process is completed. And unlike in Europe, refugees don't set foot in the United States until they are thoroughly vetted. Let's also remember who the vast majority of these refugees are. Women, children, orphans, survivors of torture.
Last week, the House of Representatives voted to suspend the admission of Syrian refugees. Senate consideration will not begin for at least another week and could be impacted by events almost anywhere. Michael Bowman, VOA News, Washington.
Well, let's turn now to Andrew Pelcheski, who's been following this debate on social media. Andrew, what have you got for us?
Thank you, Michael. Many are turning to social media to express their opinions on the Syrian refugee crisis, specifically using images and analogies to give this current crisis a historical context. This viral image plays on the story of the first European settlers in America. On the right is a pilgrim, a religious refugee who fled from England in the 1600s. On the left is a Native American who tells the pilgrim, "Sorry, but we're not accepting refugees." As we know, many Americans are descended from those pilgrims who were themselves refugees. Another viral image, a newspaper poll from just before World War II, shows 2/3 of U.S. college students unwilling to accept Jewish refugees from Europe. Now, some say that unless Syrian refugees are accepted, they could face a similar fate as Europe's Jews. Others contend that Jewish refugees pose no threat of terror attack, while they believe there is a threat from Syrians. And in this tweet from Jill, we see another historical comparison. Refusing to offer refuge reminds her of a Bible story about Joseph and Mary and innkeepers with no room in the birth of Jesus. While many conservatives are opposing refugees, some Christian groups are using this comparison as support for letting them in. In our next segment, we'll take a look at how people are connecting this crisis to their own personal histories, using their own stories to advocate for or against letting in the refugees. Michael?
Thank you, Andrew, for that. And actually, we're going to speak to a representative of a Christian evangelical organization in our next segment as well, and that organization is supportive of the refugees too. Well, now we want to dig in a little bit deeper into the polling and politics driving the debate over Syria's refugees here in the U.S. And joining us now in our D.C. studio, we have VOA's national correspondent, Jim Malone. Nice to see you here.
Hi, Michael.
Hi, we also have Professor Jennifer Marola via Skype from California. Jennifer specializes in political behavior at Claremont Graduate University in California. Welcome to you as well.
Thank you, Michael.
Well, I'd like to start with Jennifer and to talk about the recent article that you had published in the Washington Post with a colleague of yours, Elizabeth Zeckmeister. And you said that you've done 10 years of research into how U.S. public opinion is shaped by perceived terrorist threats. So can you share with us some of the main findings of that research?
Sure, I'm happy to do so. And so in a lot of our research, we argue that whenever terrorism is salient, and certainly when you have a recent terrorist attack, but even when terrorism is covered more in the news, people experience a host of negative emotions and really want to try to cope with the anxiety that's raised in that context. And so what we find is that people often, they want to circle the wagons. So they come to see groups in terms of in-groups and out-groups. So they become kind of, more supportive of people they perceive as part of their group. And then they come to have more negative attitudes towards out-groups, such as immigrants. So in a lot of our work, we found that whenever terrorism was salient, people were less supportive of immigrants in general, less supportive of more progressive immigration policies. What they also do is rally around strong leaders and even look for leaders to rescue them from the crisis situation. And so they don't just look for such leaders, they actually project stronger leadership qualities onto particular individuals. And we find that the leader who's usually most advantaged in these contexts are Republicans, in part because that party is perceived as stronger on national security. And we also usually find that male politicians are also advantaged. And then the final thing that we often find is that people come to have preferences certainly to protect the homeland. So they really want to, kind of make sure the homeland is secure. And so I think that certainly links up to the current Syrian refugee crisis. But they also, want to engage the enemy. Though in that sense, it depends on whether people are made fearful or angry in reaction to terrorist threats. If they're very fearful, they may be a little hesitant to engage the enemy too much abroad. But if they're very angry, they'll be more supportive of more hawkish foreign policies. Yes,
you mentioned Republicans there. I want to bring in Jim Malone here. Republicans have been among the most vocal about the Syrian refugee issue. Why has this become such a big, hotly contested issue in the U.S. politically?
Well, Michael, I think in the wake of the Paris attacks, the whole election campaign here in the United States for president next year has basically been reset. There's a much greater emphasis now on the threat of terrorism, on national security, and it's being exhibited in Congress with legislation they passed last week, also among the state governors who've expressed a desire in many cases not to accept any Syrian refugees, but also in the presidential campaign for sure. Outspoken Republicans like Donald Trump talking about starting a database to monitor Muslims, certainly talking about blocking the refugees from coming in. So it has created a bit of a firestorm in the country. There is a bit of fear out there in the wake of Paris, and all the politicians, I think, in the country right now are trying to deal with that. Democrats a bit differently from Republicans, but many Democrats supported the House bill last week that would halt that refugee program.
Well, I wanted to ask Jennifer, what polling evidence have you seen about how the Paris attacks and the fear and concern that Americans have about terrorism has affected support for the main presidential candidates?
Well, we are seeing, a boost with respect to perceptions of Donald Trump. So he certainly has benefited. And from our research, that's somewhat to be expected because he does put himself forth as a very bold, assertive, aggressive leader. And that's the type of candidate people look for, especially when terrorism is salient. And we also see that Hillary Clinton is doing well. So even though she is, on the Democratic side of the aisle, and that party is usually little weaker on terrorism. She has foreign policy experience, especially as Secretary of State. And so, we're seeing in polls that the public does perceive her as, one of the best candidates able to handle the issue of terrorism.
And one of the issues that people are having to grapple with here in the U.S. is President Obama's plan to bring in 10,000 Syrian refugees in the next year. And I wanted to ask Jim, what has the response been to the Obama plan, and how has he reacted to that?
Well, the Republicans are dead set against it. I saw a poll this morning out of Iowa among Republican caucus goers. They'll be voting February 1st. It was like 81% to 13% not to allow in the Syrian refugees into Iowa. So obviously there's a fear factor here. Our other guest mentioned Hillary Clinton. She's taken a different tone. She wants to be very tough on ISIS, but also says it's destructive for the United States to be keeping people out and to use the kind of divisive rhetoric we've seen from Donald Trump. And a lot of Democrats believe in the general election, some of this harsh rhetoric from Trump or Ben Carson may come back to haunt the Republicans. But right now, because of the fear factor, that rhetoric is playing well, and we see Trump actually continuing to lead in the Republican polls.
Thanks, Jim. We'll see if that trend continues. Well, we'd like to thank Jim and Jennifer for your contributions. We're going to take a short break now, actually, but when we come back, we will speak with two people on the front lines of this debate over Syrian refugees in the States. Their thoughts coming right up.
Tweet us at #VOA.
I'm Mil Arcega. I'm the host of VOA's The Correspondents, a roundup of the world's top stories with analysis from our dedicated reporters. It's really a conversation the same way that you would bring a friend to your home and ask them what's going on. And our correspondents will do that and answer those questions through their own eyes.
That appears a false choice in more ways than one.
We can't actually put you there, but we can come pretty close. In 30 minutes, we'll show you the world.
I'm Sonny Young from the sunny side of sports, and this is VOA. Follow us on Africa 54. Go to facebook.com/VOA Africa 54.
Welcome back to #VOA. I'm Michael Lippin, and we're discussing the debate over bringing Syrian refugees into the U.S. Before we introduce our next guests, let's go back to our Andrew Palchevsky with reaction on social media. Andrew.
Thank you, Michael. The opinions being expressed on social media aren't just for or against admitting Syrian refugees. People are looking at the issue from all kinds of angles, and many of them are personal. Like Fang's story of her parents' journey to the U.S. from Southeast Asia. She wonders what would have happened to them if the U.S. had closed its borders when they came as refugees fleeing communism. Even though his parents were refugees accepted by the United States, Johnny thinks that anyone coming to the U.S. should go through a legal immigration process, just as his parents did. Now, Philip counters the comparison we discussed in our last segment between Jewish refugees of the 1930s with Syrian refugees of today. His argument that Syrian refugees pose a greater terrorism risk, a fiercely debated claim on social media. But these aren't the only stories out there. We know that you, our viewers, have your own stories you may want to share. We want you to share those stories with us and follow us as we continue to cover this refugee crisis. You can reach out to us on Twitter and Instagram at #VOA and on Facebook at facebook.com/#VOA. Michael?
Thanks very much, Andrew. Now I'd like to bring in two more people into the discussion. First, we have Suzanne Meriden, the Director of Operations at the Syrian American Council here in Washington. Hi, Suzanne.
Hello, Michael.
And we also have Jenny Yang, Vice President of Advocacy and Policy at World Relief, which is the humanitarian arm of the National Association of Evangelicals. World Relief is an organization that provides assistance to victims of war, poverty, disaster, and persecution. Welcome to you, Jenny.
Thanks for having me.
Great to have you here. So I'd like to start with Suzanne. And I was wondering if you could tell us about the challenges that Syrian refugees have faced in the U.S. I believe we've had about 2,000 who have come into the country since the conflict started about 4 years ago.
Well, unfortunately, Michael, the Syrian refugees are very confused right now, and they're very tired because they themselves are actually fleeing terror. and here we are calling them terrorists. And unfortunately, there's such a deep-rooted misunderstanding of the conflict in Syria that's causing all of this. Basically, 5 years ago, the Syrian people went out into the streets, an outcome from the Arab Spring, and they were calling for their freedom and democracy in Syria. And unfortunately, a dictator, the Assad regime, responded with live ammunition, going after these people with barrel bombs, chemical weapons attacks, and many other forms of torture.
They're traumatized from
They're
that.
very traumatized. And here they are fleeing this. They're fleeing the Assad regime, fleeing ISIS. ISIS was basically an outcome of such a chaotic situation in Syria, and they were trying to find refuge. And here we are saying, no, we don't want you in here.
Well, critics of the current vetting system that we have for Syrian refugees say it's because of the chaos in Syria that some ISIS militants have been able to get their hands on Syrian travel documents that seem real but are actually fake. And they're worried that militants posing as Syrian refugees with legitimate-looking documents could sneak into America, and that's why they want the vetting system strengthened. How sympathetic are you to those kinds of concerns?
Well, we all should always be concerned about our security here in the United States, but the system is actually very robust. If you are a terrorist, you definitely do not want to come through the refugee process because you will be caught. But, the big rooted issue here is that there is a solution where we don't even have to be discussing all of this. If our administration and if President Obama would work with the international community and establish a no-fly zone, we could help these refugees actually stay home. Your first question to me was, how are they feeling? How are these refugees feeling? They would rather stay home. They would rather go back home, and we can make it happen for them. But unfortunately, we're not going that route, and we're causing even more chaos.
Well, one group that is trying to make those Syrian refugees feel more at home in the States is World Relief. And Jenny Yang, I wanted to ask what your organization has been doing to help these refugees so far.
Sure. So as the humanitarian arm of the National Association of Evangelicals, we've been working with refugees in places like Lebanon and Jordan, and we also are receiving them in the United States as well. As you mentioned, the U.S. received 1,682 Syrian refugees just last year, and since 2011, we received around 2,000 Syrian refugees in total. And what we've been trying to do is actually working with faith communities to say, you are welcome here, that we know that you've experienced a lot of violence and conflict in your home countries, and we want to be a welcoming community. Now, this has required a few things. First is just awareness about who refugees are and where they're coming from, but it's also meant that we also equip churches to respond tangibly. So whether or not it's picking up a refugee family at the airport, or whether or not it's providing them with a meal, or even inviting a family over for the holidays, those are the tangible things that we've been working with many churches across the country to do.
Right, and your organization would like to see more Syrian refugees coming in, and that's a position that actually is counter to the policy expressed by many leading Republicans right now in the presidential campaign, and Republicans typically court evangelicals as their base of support. So why is it that your organization has sort of contradicted that line?
Sure. Well, I think one of the hallmarks of our country and being a moral leader in this world is actually to welcome the persecuted. It's a tradition that has actually garnered a significant bipartisan support in the past. And so we've actually been very surprised at why the Refugee Resettlement Program specifically has been targeted to be shut down when it actually has rescued millions of lives. We've talked with many evangelical churches across the board who are saying, look, we want to welcome all refugees regardless of their nationality or their religion, because we know that the U.S. resettles the most vulnerable refugees around the world. And so we've been really befuddled by the reaction of many of our elected officials that are targeting a program that has worked, that has allowed many orphans and widows to actually come in through the program. And part of the practicality of the program is really informed by our theology as well. As Christians and as evangelicals, we really believe we can live out the calling of Jesus in welcoming the foreign-born and others into our communities.
Right, and I wanted to ask Suzanne, your organization wants more American political figures to realize what the situation of refugees is in America. Can you tell us a little bit about the kind of outreach that you're doing in about 30 seconds, if you can?
Sure, actually. Yeah, absolutely. So at SACS, Syrian American Council, we've actually started this initiative to go out to the governors. We've sent out invite letters saying, let's have you meet with these refugees so you can get to know them. So unfortunately, this whole refugee issue, a lot of people are using it as a plateau for their own political agendas. We want to bring the human part back into it. If some of these governors that are saying no to the refugees meet the people, get to know them, hear the real stories, then they would be more open to understand that these people do need refuge. So we actually are doing press conferences across the United States because we have chapters across, so they're helping us put together these press conferences, and we're calling for an invite, and we hope the governors react, respond, and meet these refugees along with us.
Have you had any responses yet to those appeals?
So we know we're getting a response soon from the Maryland governor. We're waiting to hear what that is, but we feel good about it, and we feel positive, and we're hoping that we can get those meetings happen.
Okay, well, we'll look out for that.
Yes.
We're going to take another short break, but we will be right back with more discussion and final thoughts from our panel. Please stay with us on #VOA.
My name's Carla Babb, and I work the Pentagon beat. That access helps me to do better stories. Every day it's my responsibility to collect all of the defense news. It keeps our VOA viewers informed. I get to travel all across the globe. Anything that's defense related and how to protect and keep people safe, that's where I'll go. So it's never a dull moment at the Pentagon. My name is Carla Babb. This is my beat.
Like us on Facebook at #VOA.
Welcome back to #VOA. I'm watching the tweets here in the control room. We have one tweet from Javi. He asks why Senators Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio are against admitting Syrian refugees, especially since their own parents fled Cuba and found home and safety here in the United States. Neither lawmaker has responded directly to that. And then I want to give you a tweet from Mayor Kay. He was born in Syria. He's been here since he's 5 years old. Since he was 5, I'm sorry, and he is now the mayor of Prospect Park, New Jersey, and he says, kicking the weak while they're down was never American value. So there you go. Let's go back to Michael and Andrew in Studio 52.
Thanks very much, John, for that. Andrew, actually, you'd like to follow up with our guest in California. Please go ahead.
I would. Professor Merola, I wanted to talk to you. Michael referenced this Washington Post article that you did. I wanted to go back to that. You wrote that terror events can rapidly change public opinion and political opinion, and we certainly saw that, as John was just talking about, through social media. But do you think social media can work for what our guests here in D.C. are talking about, these Syrian refugees, these what you call out groups, these immigrants that are coming in? Can social media maybe be a voice for them? Is it something that can change and shift the opinion? Is it something that amplifies the public opinion? How does it kind of fit into what you wrote about in the Post?
Well, it can potentially be relevant, especially if there are messages that are, coming out through social media that aren't being covered by the press. Though one factor that is important with respect to that is how heterogeneous someone's network is on social media, right? So if you have someone who's Republican and, has friends who are mostly Republican, and they're kind of forwarding messages that are, only related to opposition to Syrian refugees, it's, they're not going to get exposed to those counter messages. And so whether it has an effect will depend in part on, if people are friends with those in the, other side of the aisle. And so they would be exposed to some of those counter messages.
Right. And I know a lot of the hashtags, which we always talk about on the show what the next hashtag will be, a lot of those are drawing in both sides of this argument. So maybe those hashtags can maybe draw the conversation forward and draw more people in to talk about these issues, kind of become a conversation space.
I think so. And I will say from some other research I've done just on immigration more generally, whenever you're highlighting the situation, especially with respect to children who are really innocent, that can be a very powerful, persuasive message. So I think the more kind of messages like that are out in the airwaves, that can kind of counter some of the negative press that's out there and the negative arguments against Syrian refugees.
Yeah, and those are the pictures we're seeing going viral, the young children, the young boy washed up on the beach exactly. in Greece. Those are the images that stick with people.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, thank you, Jennifer, for that. I'd like to bring the conversation back to Suzanne and Jenny with me here in the studio. And I wanted to ask Suzanne about a particularly controversial element of the debate coming from Republican presidential candidates like Ted Cruz and Jeb Bush. They actually say they would prefer just to bring in Syrian Christian refugees rather than Muslims, and they say that's because the Christians in particular are being persecuted and driven out by Islamic State because of their religion, while the Syrian Muslims are also escaping conflict. It's the Christians they want to focus on because of that religious element. What do you think of that argument?
So two things. Number one, as presidential candidates, it's really upsetting that they would speak from such a point of view when our Constitution would completely dismiss that argument. Our forefathers would not be happy with that commentary. But number two is, again, another huge misunderstanding of what ISIS does in Syria. Actually, one of their biggest massacres is over 700 Muslim people. So that understanding is very scary because it can cause a lot of these arguments, and when the presidential candidates come out and speak during their debates, speak during interviews, they are misinforming the public, unfortunately. So, we really ask people to ask more questions, get more information, because these are rumors that are being spread, and lots of people are believing them.
Well, just wanted to ask Jenny, since you represent a Christian organization, when you hear these arguments being made, let's help the Christians before everyone else, how do you respond to that?
Sure. So I do think we need to help religious minorities in the Middle East, including Christians, but helping Christians doesn't mean it has to come at the expense of other refugees, like Muslims who are also persecuted. The hallmark of the U.S. resettlement program is that we accept the most vulnerable refugees, regardless of their nationality or religion, and I think that it should remain that way. We have a strong tradition of welcoming any and all, and we resettle less than 1% of the world's refugees, which means that we really need to welcome the most vulnerable.
And in terms of welcoming refugees, there are some conservative groups in America, like the Center for Immigration Studies, who say that the cost to American taxpayers of bringing refugees in is quite high because refugees require a lot of care. They require help to find jobs. Some of them end up on welfare, and they look at the aid that we send overseas and say, maybe we should better spend that money on Syrian refugees where they are in the region. What do you think of that argument?
Well, when you look at what's happening in the region, I've been to Jordan, and they're hosting almost 20% of their population are Syrian refugees. The numbers that we're talking about in the United States, it's only 10,000 over the next year, which is a drop in the bucket compared to what our allies in the region are facing. So to say that we can accept 10,000 is not a huge number, and also we work with communities all across the country that are welcoming them, businesses that employ refugees, faith communities that want to welcome them as an expression of their faith. So there is a lot of community support for refugees. We're not just putting them in places where they wouldn't be welcome.
Well, Suzanne, can you tell us a little bit about some of the positive aspects of refugee resettlement in America? Because there are ways that they can benefit the communities that they move to, right?
Absolutely, and I'm so glad you brought in the word positive, because we sometimes tend to focus on the negativity that's being said. There is actually a lot of positivity coming out. A lot of people are calling us. We actually have a hotline at SAG. People calling to say, what can we do? How can we help? We want to adopt. We want to sponsor refugees. And we play this role of really connecting our members, if you will, to organizations like Jenny's organization, so that then they can help, they can see how they can actually help. But the positivity of bringing in refugees into the United States, that means a lot of new talent, a lot of new skills, a lot of cultural perspective. We always like to use the example of Steve Jobs is of Syrian descent.
Syrian descent. That's
Absolutely.
Another Syrian American for you.
Absolutely. So there's a lot of positivity there. Again, we just need to ask the right questions and find out more information and be able to assess correctly.
I think that's about all the time we have for this topic in this week's show, but thanks to all of you. I'd like to thank our guests, Jim Malone, our national correspondent, also Jennifer Marola in California, the political behavior expert at Claremont University, and also to Jenny Yang, of course, with World Relief, and Suzanne Meriden of the Syrian American Council. And I'd like to encourage all of our viewers to visit our website, voanews.com/#VOA. You can also tweet us with your comments and suggestions at #VOA. For Andrew, John, and all of the team here at Voice of America, I'd like to thank you for watching, and we'll see you again next time.